During the height of the empire, Rome had over 1 million inhabitants. But by the time the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, the city had already shrunk dramatically, its population reduced to a fraction of what it once was. While we often treat the fall of Rome as a grand tragedy, a collapse into chaos and barbarity, that's not how it felt to everyone living through it. For many, burdened by heavy taxes and a failing system, it felt less like the end of the world and more like relief. Sometimes, the collapse of a massive system doesn't feel like a disaster. It feels like finally being allowed to breathe. Historians still argue about Rome. But one line from Stanford historian Walter Scheidel cuts through all of it. The Roman Empire made modern development possible by going away and never coming back. Things that define the modern world today, such as the scientific method, nation-state, and industrialization, would not have been possible had an overextended empire continued to burden the continent. This is episode 1 of Controversial History, where we look at why the fall of Rome might actually be among the most positive events to take place in history. Today, Rome survives as stone and ruins in modern-day Italy. The Colosseum still stands. The Roman Forum still draws visitors. But that version of Rome is only a memory. It does not reflect the pressure building inside the empire during its final centuries. By then, the empire was already suffering a deep internal rot. One of the clearest signs of this came during the crisis of the 3rd century. At that time, Rome had stopped feeling like an unstoppable empire. Emperors were being killed, borders were under attack, and the economy was cracking under pressure. Because during this time, the empire changed emperors repeatedly. Some ruled for only a few months before being removed or killed. At the same time, the economy began to weaken in ways people could feel in daily life. Roman coins slowly lost their silver content as emperors reduced metal value to pay for rising military and administrative costs. This weakened trust in money and pushed inflation across the empire. And as money lost strength, the trade routes that once connected the Mediterranean world also began to weaken. Meanwhile, a new emperor stepped in, Diocletian. He was a soldier who understood that one man could no longer hold this empire together. So he split power between 4 rulers. If Rome was too big for one emperor, maybe 4 could keep it alive. He also tried to control prices directly through state orders, which showed how serious inflation had become. But these reforms did not fully solve the deeper issue. The empire had become too large, too complex, and too expensive to manage smoothly. Imagine trying to govern millions of people across 3 continents without modern transport, without instant communication, and without even knowing how fast a crisis was spreading. A decision made in Rome could take weeks to reach Britain, North Africa, or the eastern frontier. And by the time the order arrived, the problem had often already changed. That meant Rome stopped planning for the future. It started surviving from emergency to emergency. And systems that live like that rarely stay strong for long. They may survive for a while, but they stop leading history. And by the final century of Western Rome, the empire still existed in name. But real control was fading. Authority was no longer fully centralized in the emperor. Military leaders gained more influence than civilian institutions. And regional governors made decisions without waiting for Rome. So, eventually, the emperor became more symbolic than powerful. And then a major turning point came in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople. By this time, Rome was relying heavily on the Goths, a Germanic people who had entered Roman territory while fleeing the Huns. Rome allowed them to settle inside the empire in exchange for military service. It seemed like a practical solution, but corruption, mistreatment, and broken promises turned that deal into rebellion. When Roman forces marched to stop them near Adrianople, the result was disaster. The army was crushed, and Emperor Valens was killed on the battlefield. So, this lost battle was a big shock to the Roman world. For centuries, Rome had looked unbeatable. Adrianople proved it was not. It showed that the empire could no longer easily control the same groups it once expected to command. After Adrianople, Rome trusted more and more of its survival to people outside its old system. These were the foederati, non-Roman groups, mostly Germanic tribes, who served inside the Roman military as allies. So, Rome got soldiers, and the borders stayed protected. But the balance was changing. The empire was negotiating from weakness rather than commanding from strength. By the early 400s, as the Western Empire weakened, entire regions began slipping away. Britain was abandoned. North Africa was lost. Spain and Gaul gradually came under the control of new political groups. Rome was still mentioned in official language. But in reality, it no longer controlled everything it once did. Then came the moment people could no longer ignore. 410 AD. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under their leader, Alaric. The Visigoths were a Germanic group who had once lived near Rome's borders and were partly inside its military system before turning against it. And this was bigger than a military defeat. It was emotional and psychological. For generations, people held one belief: that Rome may struggle, but Rome itself stands forever. That belief finally died in 410. The city that symbolized power suddenly looked vulnerable. Rome was not untouchable, and it could be broken. Then in 455 AD, the Vandals came again. The Vandals were another Germanic group that had already taken control of parts of North Africa before attacking Rome itself. They looted the city for days. By now, the pattern was obvious that Rome was not collapsing in one moment. It was slowly being replaced, one region and one event at a time. That slow shift finally reached what history later called the official end. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power by a Germanic commander named Odoacer. But what is important here is not the violence or destruction. It is in what follows. Odoacer did not try to restore the Western Empire. He did not claim to be a Roman emperor. Instead, he took control of Italy as a ruler in his own right and sent the imperial symbols to Constantinople. In simple terms, he was acknowledging a reality that the Western Roman Empire no longer functioned as a real political system. By the time anyone marked its end, it had already been replaced in practice. Here is the part most people miss. Rome's collapse did not simply destroy Europe. It broke a monopoly. Instead of one power controlling everything, the map broke into smaller kingdoms. The Franks took much of Gaul. The Visigoths ruled Spain. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy. And yes, from the outside, that looked like a decline. Cities that once depended on Rome had to adapt on their own. But underneath that chaos, something important was happening. Rebuilding of Europe. Power was no longer trapped inside one giant system. And when power spreads out, competition begins. Different kingdoms had to compete to survive. A weak ruler could be replaced. A slow system could be overtaken by a faster one. No one could afford to stay comfortable for too long. That pressure changed behavior. It pushed small improvements, better decisions, and faster adaptation. And over time, those small improvements started shaping history. It also meant ideas had more than one chance to survive. If one ruler rejected something, it did not have to die there. It could travel somewhere else. And that changed the math of progress. One example came centuries later with Christopher Columbus. He first presented his plan to reach Asia by sailing west, but it was rejected by one court because the risk seemed too high and the calculations were uncertain. Instead of ending there, he took the same idea to another court, where it was eventually accepted and funded. And the journey moved forward. That kind of second chance only worked in a fragmented world. A world with multiple competing centers of power. And in the same environment, another kind of structure was rising in a different direction. As Roman authority faded, the Church stepped into spaces the empire had left behind. It helped preserve education. It kept written records alive. It offered local stability when governments kept changing and borders kept shifting. In many places, it became the one institution people could still rely on. So, basically, many smaller systems were learning how to survive, adapt, and grow on their own. But prior knowledge was also preserved by the church. This meant that once the region stabilized again, it was primed for explosive innovation. This is what makes the period so important. Decline and development were happening at the same time. This is exactly the point where the story changes. Because if fragmentation were only destruction, Europe should have stayed in permanent decline. But history went in a different direction. Europe did not stay stuck, and because there was competition, the ruling classes were open to experimenting with new ideas. Economists like Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson later explained this through institutions. The idea is actually simple. Institutions are the rules of a society. They decide who gets power, who gets rewarded, and whether new ideas are welcomed or shut down. In late Rome, many of those rules were built to protect the people already at the top. And honestly, that created order, but it also made real change much harder. When the same elite families controlled wealth, land, and influence, preserving the old system felt much safer than trying something new. Then Rome broke apart. And suddenly, Europe looked completely different. Instead of one giant empire, there were many smaller kingdoms, city-states, and regional powers, all competing with each other. That competition changed everything. Now, innovation was not waiting for permission from one emperor or a massive bureaucracy. It depended on survival across many. If one kingdom resisted change, another might adopt it. Over time, that created space for slow but steady development. You could see this shift everywhere. Farming improved with crop rotation and the heavy plow, which helped produce more food and support larger populations. Universities began forming in cities like Bologna and Paris, where learning developed outside direct political control. Military systems also evolved because constant competition forced adaptation in defense and organization. Trade also returned, especially where stronger local economies gave leaders real advantages. Under Rome, life felt predictable but rigid. After Rome, life felt uncertain but open. So, you see, this progress was uneven and slow, but it kept moving. And sometimes, history changes exactly like that. This major change in history leaves us with a bigger question in mind. If this kind of development was possible in fragmented Europe, why did other powerful empires follow a different direction? Look at the Ottoman Empire or Ming China. Back then, they were miles ahead of Europe, richer, stronger, and much more organized. But they had one thing Europe didn't: a single off switch. See, when power is that centralized, one bad decision can stall an entire civilization. For example, the Ottoman sultans basically blocked the printing press for nearly 300 years because they were worried it would undermine their control over information. And because there was only one authority, that ban actually worked. An entire region stayed stuck in the hand-copied era while the rest of the world was moving on. It was the same story in China. The Ming dynasty once had the most incredible navy on the planet. Ships that made European vessels look like tiny toys. But then, the emperor just decided to stop. He ordered the fleets to be burned, banned overseas trade, and turned the empire inward. Just like that, the world's greatest maritime power vanished overnight, simply because one person said so. In those empires, if the guy at the top said no, the story ended right there. But in post-Roman Europe, there was no off switch. Just a crowded room of rivals, each trying to outpace the others. Rulers couldn't afford to look inward. If you banned the printing press but your neighbor embraced it, they'd soon have a better army and economy. You had to innovate just to survive. This is exactly why the printing press spread so fast, even though the elites were terrified of it. It's also why movements like the Protestant Reformation didn't just get snuffed out. If one ruler tried to silence a revolutionary thinker, that person would just move across the border to a rival court that was happy to use those ideas to gain an edge. In the end, revolutionary ideas found fertile ground. not because the kings were being open-minded, but because they were terrified of falling behind. That edge didn't come from a master plan. It came from the pressure. All these different systems kept pushing against each other, and that constant friction is what actually forced the modern world into existence. Rome's fall feels like an ending, but it works more like a system reset in how societies actually grow. One system holding everything together can look powerful and even reassuring, but it also slows down how far ideas can travel and how fast problems get fixed. Once Rome broke apart, Europe entered a more uneven world where different rulers were forced to accept innovation for survival. They competed, copied, and challenged each other. That competition created constant pressure, and pressure pushed change forward, even without anyone planning it. We saw this lesson play out even in modern times during the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were rivals, but only one was more decentralized without the center trying to control everything. The US surged ahead with its more flexible economy while the Soviets stagnated and ultimately collapsed.